Right, well, thank you, Becca. So as Becca said, I'm going to talk about modules 1 through 4. So these are the modules that we're really using to help frame your study, put your team together, and learn about data collection and what kind of data collection there is, and then kind of putting it all together before this afternoon we go a little bit further. And so feel free to stop me at any point and ask questions during it. It probably works better than waiting till the end. So this first one is structuring an assessment. And so first, before you even structure the assessment, you need to ask yourself, why am I doing this assessment? So before you even do this, what will it help me accomplish? What do I already know and what has been done already? So that's kind of key to look, okay, are there studies out there that have already done this in my community? Are there studies out there that have done this in another community that I can look at? But what do we already know and what has been done already? We don't want to replicate previous efforts. You want to, why have previous efforts not been enough? Why are they insufficient? So why am I doing this? What do I want to answer? Why hasn't it been answered before sufficiently? So don't perform an assessment just to have an assessment. So that's kind of key. If it's not the information isn't already out there, or maybe it's old, you have to have a good reason to perform the assessment. And then a lot of people don't think about this, but what a team you assemble at the very beginning is going to be really important. So every assessment needs to have a steering committee, and you want to try to find a representative from each of the relevant sectors that are important to what you're looking at here. So that could be geographic region or desired skill set. So if you can't find a representative for each sector, region, or skill set, you've already learned something about this food system. So let's say the region has, your region is a set of 3 counties, and you can't find anybody in one of the counties working in this area. Well, that's some important information to know that, okay, there is nobody in this county working in this area. What does that mean? What's going on with that? So assemble your team and consider the whole food system. So a lot of people, when we think food systems, well, maybe not us in this room, but a lot of people, when they think food systems, we think farmer and consumer. But think about the whole food system, starting from farmer to aggregators to processors to wholesalers to distributors, institutions, restaurants, retailers, consumers, and even the waste recycling at the other end of things. So when you're assembling your team, don't just make it a bunch of consumers, producers. Think about the whole food system. And so when you're assembling a team, does your team possess the necessary skills? So it's kind of a funny little cartoon here. I don't know how to do statistics, but it doesn't matter because I don't have data. So does your team possess all the necessary skills that they need? Do you need to hire a facilitator for your team? Do you need somebody that has the skills to get that conversation going? Can the local university or extension office provide some assistance? Can you go to them? Are there policy analysts, there are advocates, data analysts? GIS mapping background, and we'll show you some images here later, but that can be really helpful to tell your story. If you have somebody that's able to overlay this data on maps, that can be really helpful. Strong writers, relevant language and cultural knowledge. You want people that know the local area. Do you have good public speakers, graphic designers? So as you're assembling this team, this is kind of a good list of some of the check boxes that you might want to look at. So as you're going through these modules 1 through 4, it's kind of a good way to, as you're setting up your team, start reading through module 1, and there's a list of even more questions in there than I cover now. And those are good questions you can ask yourself as you're putting together your team. And you also want to try to enlist your analyst up front. And analyst, depending on how far you want to go in the analysis, that'll be a different kind of analyst. But you kind of want to have an idea in mind when you're assembling your team at the very beginning, who is going to be your analyst. You also want to know who is your target audience or population. And so once you've identified who your target audience is, does your team represent the intended audience or community well? So you want to be engaging the local community. You want your planning team to be a part of the local community, to represent the local community. And be careful about overstudying or underserving your community. So the overstudying, that's the idea. Has this already been done before? And then just the idea that assessments are often done to a community and not with a community. So you want to try to avoid this. So you want to make sure the community is involved. The community has some skin in the game in some way, shape, or form as you're putting this together. You look like you're about to.
This is a really important point. So I'm just guessing that, with many of you who have affiliations with the university, that this is something that I think at academic institutions we often are rightly accused of doing. And so just thinking about how do you actually provide information to your community that they may not have, make them part of the process to make sure that they understand the data that's being collected. They understand how to use the data that's being collected. They can help interpret it, right? The community really needs to be part of this process because ultimately we're trying to empower our communities, right? We're trying to help in community development efforts. And so thinking about not just sort of extracting data that we're studying a community, but actually engaging and empowering communities through data collection processes. This is something we just don't do enough in academic institutions. So we just really want to make I think this is a really important point.
Thank you.
Okay.
Let's see if this is going to make a loud sound is on the thing. Are there any questions? Everybody's very quiet. Has anybody done this and tried to assemble a team? Has anybody gone through this process and have any insights on how it's not as easy as it sounds?
I do have a question. One of the problems we run into is having community involvement. They'll come to the table maybe once, if that. Do you have any suggestions? Because I mean, it is a vital point to have, the community at the table. But if they're uninterested or not wanting to be there.
The question was, how do you get the community involved?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really key piece. And actually, this is not my area of expertise, but we have had people come and talk about community readiness. Has anyone done these community readiness tests? So community readiness, right? Because one of the challenges is that if the community isn't interested in participating, maybe it's not the community that you want to be doing this assessment, right? If they're not sort of ready to be part of this process. That's a key piece. And actually, several years ago, I was part of a process that the Ford Foundation helped to facilitate. And it was in a community or they were trying to figure out how to help this one region in Mississippi, right? And it was a really sort of underserved area. And what they ended up doing was actually finding someone in the community who had a lot of social capital, right? Someone who people respected and who seemed like they could really be a leader. And they went and helped to train this individual, right? They brought them sort of out of the community for a little bit and sort of trained them in a leadership capacity kind of way, and then sent them back into the community with a small amount of money to really kind of build up some of those networks and relationships, because they realized that they had to invest some time in doing that piece before they could even start to think about having a true kind of community process and doing this kind of plan. Every community is going to be at a different place at a different time, and so what we're trying to do with this toolkit, we understand that it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. It's going to look different every community. Every community may not be ready to do something here, and as Becky's going to get to in a minute here, there's some communities that are going to be ready to do entire assessments of their food system, looking at the economic impacts of their whole food system because they have all of the right people at the table, right? They've got the retailers and everyone along that supply chain. There's going to be other communities that maybe have a small farmer's market that they've just gotten off the ground, and they're going to start with thinking about how does this farmer's market, impact our community on a very different level where they may not need such broad representation from the entire community. So, hope that helps.
Dave, did you? So again, as we were talking about the study parameters, and so you have your team together, you've got your goal, but now dig into it a little deeper. Okay, so not only what is the goal of the study, but who is the primary audience of the study? What community is it serving, and how is it serving them? And how will you measure success? So that's a big one. So we're going to need some metrics, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but how are you going to measure success? So what is a successful study? Who cares about your results, and how will they use the information? Because we're all not going out there doing research, doing this study, spending all this money so it can sit on a desk. So who's going to use it, and how are they going to use it? So you get what you measure. So this is kind of a good little example of how you do get what you measure. So for example, this is a question was asked to producers, basically, are you involved in sustainable agriculture? And this is how they framed it, and this is how they defined sustainable agriculture. So under the 1990 Farm Bill, sustainable agriculture was defined as an integrated system of plant and animal production practices having a site-specific application that will, over the long term, okay, satisfy human food and fiber needs, enhance environmental quality, make the most efficient use of non-renewable resources, sustain economic viability, enhance the quality of life for the farmers as a whole. So if you define sustainable agriculture as this way, take a guess, how many of the producers said that they did sustainable agriculture? 98% said, yes, we do sustainable agriculture. And the other 2% just didn't consider themselves farmers. So think about how that question was framed. Did they gain any useful information from that? Maybe not. So what did the client actually want to know? What was the question that they were actually trying to ask?
Are you using environmentally sustainable, low-impact ag practices?
Exactly. So she said, are you using environmentally sustainable, low-impact ag practices? Maybe a list of those practices or something like that. So you get what you ask. So how you ask those questions and how you frame those questions is going to be really important because you're putting a lot of effort into this assessment. So if you come out and you ask a question like that and you put all this time and energy and you come back with a result like this, it can be really disheartening. So measuring goals and objectives. So let's say your goal was to create opportunities for small-scale farmers. Well, what is so my goal is I want to create opportunities for small-scale farmers. But what does that look like? There's a lot of different pieces that can be a part of that goal. So maybe my objective on this is to increase the farmers market traffic, size, or sales. But even that, we need to have specific measures. So how am I going to measure this? How am I going to measure that I'm reaching that goal? So remember I said, what is success? What does success look like? Well, how am I going to measure it? Maybe with this example, I could look at, okay, what's the foot traffic? I have somebody looking who's coming in and out of the farmer's market. Or sales per vendor, or number of vendors. So you need to think of the exact metrics that you're going to use to measure if you're getting to your goal.
And this may be getting into the weeds, but it seems like whenever you start asking people about sales per vendor or how much money you make, that's a real challenge. So I don't know if y'all are going to address that today. You know, traditionally, any of us who work with these farmers who are direct marketing, it's such an underreported, part of our agricultural system, which has major repercussions for policy.
Yep.
And we haven't been able to address that, short of asking people, I mean, even if you try to do an anonymous survey, basically how much money do you make? I mean, who's going to answer that? And
Good question.
so I hope we can talk more about that today because we all need suggestions for that.
Good. So let me summarize it a little bit for the camera. It was basically sometimes, and let me know if I'm not paraphrasing you right, but basically sometimes they don't want to give you this sensitive information, and it's difficult to get this information that you want. And that's part of what you need to do when you're framing how you're going to measure your goal and what your metrics are. That's part of getting the community engaged. A very engaged community that is understanding what benefits that they're going to get from this research is going to make them more likely to give you that information. And it's also the idea of, as a lot of you were in university, a lot of you are in the same area, if you can coordinate efforts so that we're not over asking. So sometimes a lot of those producers are getting asked over and over and over again these same kind of questions. And so if we can somehow coordinate our efforts so that you're not asking this farmer and then a month later somebody else is going and asking those farmers.
And I'll just say too, this thing, I've done a ton of surveying of producers. Number one, you cannot send, online surveys. You get terrible response rates, you get really bad information. It requires strong relationships. This is one of the reasons extension is so important, right? Because we all work out in the communities and actually have relationships with these folks. You can't get this information if you don't have trust and relationships there. It's just not possible. Two, what we try to say now at Colorado State is we provide a lot of support to producers, right? We helped a lot of producers write these farmers market promotion program grants or these other kinds of grants. And what we say to them is that if you're going to get support from us, we're public dollars, right? It means that you're going to have to provide some information, maybe anonymously, but that's sort of what you're saying. If we're going to help you, you have to help us a little bit. And in turn, we can help you more. So that's another piece of it. We only do these kinds of, we ask questions in person. We really try to do interviews. It's more time consuming and expensive, but you got to get good information. And then we have some other ways. We were talking about this a little bit at dinner last night. So sometimes, you know, I don't like doing those categories of dollars, but we can say now we have enough data that's available. We can say, okay, an average producer in your region with your primary commodity looks like this. Tell us how you're different. Right? Are you X amount higher, are you X amount lower? So we try to do things in terms of percentages, that sometimes helps. And then with our farmers markets, you know, we actually can track it now at the farmers market itself, right? Because we participate in the Double Up Buck programs, and so we do exchanges of tokens, or you know, some of the farmers market have fees based on these different on sales amounts. So we can track it a little bit that way as well. Some markets are obviously every market's different, but those are some of the things that we've been able to do. But really, it's just those trust and relationships, and just you'll see, especially as we get into the weeds here a little bit more, you cannot do online surveys for this kind of data.
Any other follow-ups on that? Because these questions are really good. So again, we talked about identifying the team and putting together the team. So now let's look about identifying the study parameters and your priority issues. So first, what are the geographic boundaries for the study? And you'll see as we get in later this afternoon how important that is. So there's a couple things you might look at when you're just trying to decide those geographic boundaries for the studies. Well, if you're looking at secondary data, which we'll talk about here in a minute, it's easy to find stuff by county lines or certain geographical lines that are set by political standards. So maybe your geographical boundaries are a county line or something like that it's easy to get data and easy to get secondary data. But sometimes those geographic boundaries aren't very good for looking at how the actual market. Maybe that geographical boundary doesn't really represent the market. So what are you going to set up for your geographical boundary, knowing there's trade-offs there? What do you define as your local food system? We know that everybody defines local a little bit different. So what is local in your study? How are you defining local? Be very cognizant of that up front, so everybody's on the same page as to what local is. What is the time frame for your study? So how long do you have? Because if your time frame's really tight, you're very limited in what you can do versus a longer study. So right up front, what is our time frame from this, and what resources do we have to support this? So does the scope of your study align with the resources available? So if you have very little resources and you want a huge study, right at the beginning you need to think about, okay, how much can we really do with our resources? So you have to set up boundaries up front. So for our Northern Colorado Regional Food Assessment, we decided no primary data collection. So right up front, are we doing, and I'll talk about what the difference between primary and secondary is here. That's modules 2 and 3. But so set those boundaries up front. Others, are we doing only produce? Are we doing only one county? Are we looking at only low-income healthy food access? So really reining it in up front, exactly what are your parameters and what are your priorities? And that'll save you a lot of heartache later. And so this one I almost should have put a little bit later when we talk a little bit about looking at the data. But notice here, I said that you might want somebody that does GIS, because it's nice to overlay some of the information on maps. It also can be really helpful to have somebody that's a graphic designer that can put stuff together and portray a lot of information in kind of an easy to understand, easy way. So think about this, looking at this table, we kind of have some information about the Crossroads Farmers Market. So this is just a farmers market, but they were the first in the US to double federal nutrition benefits. What does this market look like? And portraying the information in this way is a lot easier to read, a lot more easy to understand than, say, putting it in a table of data. But notice here, 75% of the vendors are immigrants. 1,000 community members received healthy eating education at the market. On an average Wednesday has over 1,000 people. But see all this information that's contained in one little infographic that's easy to digest. And so working within your resources, so if you have resources only to do a small study, well, is there a plan later to reassess or reevaluate in the future? And this preliminary study, let's say you don't have very much resources, but you set this study up very well and are able to do a good job within your resources, that can often set the stage for a larger assessment and be used to help you get more funding in the future. So sometimes, if you're frustrated by the fact there aren't many resources, I can't do everything I want, well, it can be an opportunity to do something small now and use that to help you branch out and get more resources in the future to do something bigger.